I think a lot of us were surprised when watching The Secret of the Mimic trailer, not just for the marvelous visuals and expansive environment, but more about its story. At a first glance, this game seems to go against a lot of the Mimic's origin from Tales from the Pizzaplex. Things like Edwin's factory being much larger in this game and is filled with Fazbear Entertainment items, and from what we can see from the outside, it also has a little shop that sells masks, toys, etc. All of that is unlike the short story, which was set in an old lace factory that Edwin barely changed. Moreover, the manor seems to have employees other than Edwin. The reason I say this is because of the various posters, unlike the short story where Edwin only worked alone. The factory being called Edwin's Costume Manor implies that Edwin makes both animatronics and costumes, which isn't accurate to the story because Edwin in the story only made animatronics from costumes Fazbear Entertainment sent. And lastly, Hand Unit says that the Mimic was something developed for Fazbears.
Enter the warehouse and retrieve the technology that he was developing for us. It's a kind of prototype endoskeleton that can adapt to any costume and become any character.
But in the short story, Edwin made the Mimic because it could keep his son David busy while Edwin worked. Now some of you might hear this and conclude that the Tales version of events isn't accurate to what happened in the games, and that Steelwool only took elements from that story and made their own take on it. And while I understand why, I don't think that's the case. I think whatever story Secret of the Mimic tells us will line up with the Tales version of events. But before we deep dive into how, let's just quickly summarize Mimic's story from Tales. Edwin was a Fazbear engineer that made endoskeletons for costumes Fazbear Entertainment would send. Edwin had his own company years before, but because he wasn't making a profit anymore, he sold his company to Fazbear Enterprises. Edwin was struggling being a single father and working tirelessly for Fazbears, so he came up with the idea of making a robot friend for David to keep him busy while Edwin did his work. In the next few weeks, Edwin would create the Mimic and its program, Mimic 1. David loved the Mimic and they both bonded really fast. One day, however, David would chase his ball out of the factory and into a road. Eventually, a van would hit David and he dies. 2 weeks later, Edwin was mourning the loss of his son, and he barely worked on the animatronics, when he saw a Mimic doing one of its hand signs that David had taught him for wanting ice cream. Edwin snapped and grabbed a metal pole and battered Mimic with it, pouring all his rage and agony onto Mimic's systems. When Edwin was done, he collapsed on the floor next to the broken Mimic. Months later, a team are sent by Fazbears to Edwin's abandoned factory with no clear instructions of what to do. Apparently, Edwin had disappeared, and so the property reverted to Fazbear Entertainment. When the team arrived, they assumed they had to finish Edwin's work, so they repaired some of the animatronics and the broken Mimic. Mimic would then activate and started killing the team, because it mimicked and somewhat felt Edwin's anger and rage. A month later, Fazbear sends another team into Edwin's factory, and they are also killed by the Mimic wearing various costumes. Flash forward decades later to when Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex was in early construction. The construction crew were sent the new Glamrock animatronics, but one of those animatronics was the old Mimic, notably having a burnt body and a shiny head with rabbit ears. Since no one knew what to do with the old Endo, one of the workers that were a part of the team that were renovating the old pizza place took the Mimic and programmed him to help him with removing the heads and limbs of all the old Endos in the pizza place. The Mimic does this and then turns on the workers and tears their arms and heads from their bodies. One of the workers escapes and tells the others to seal the place. The next epilogues follow a group of teenagers that break into the sealed pizza place, and are then hunted by the Mimic. One of these teens find an old notebook that belonged to one of the original Fazbear Entertainment creation team. The notebook states that after the Mimic story, the creation team created multiple Mimic endoskeletons, Mimic Model 1s and Model 2s, The reason they made them were because they didn't want to have to program every endo with every show routine step by step. That was a lot of coding, so they just programmed the mimic to basically watch and learn. The mimics were designed to fit into any costume, and its main objective was to observe the other routines and then mimic them. At the end of the epilogues, the last remaining teen manages to get the mimic inside a spring-lock jester suit and spring-lock it, which made it easier to deactivate him. Flash forward again to when the Pizzaplex is open. Edwin had returned to Fazbear's years before, and because of his contract with Fazbear's, he was made one of the board of directors, even though he had little power. The board chairman of Fazbear's, Mr. Burroughs, decides to fire everyone in the creative writing team and replace it with an AI called the Storyteller. The Storyteller would create new stories and actions for the animatronics. The Storyteller would be housed inside a large baobab tree in the middle of the Pizzaplex's atrium. Edwin hated the idea, but he was outvoted, and the project goes into full force. Edwin had a bad feeling about the Storyteller, that was further solidified when he snuck into the Pizzaplex late at night and saw workers moving a huge white tiger head into the interior of the tree. Edwin freaks out and is reminded of his son's death, but he eventually calms himself and leaves. In the following days, Edwin would see the Pizzaplex's systems and animatronics have been acting strange and unnatural, and he is sure that the Storyteller is the causes of these glitches. Edwin eventually finds a way inside the Storyteller's tree, and sees the huge tiger head, and sees the programming it's running, Mimic 1. He freaks out and now understands why the animatronics have been behaving strangely. So then, Edwin sneaks into the tree every night to try and stop the Storyteller. Burroughs would find out that Edwin was sneaking into the tree, and blames him for the problems the Pizzaplex has been facing. So one day, when Edwin goes into the tree, Burroughs sealed him inside. Inside the tree was airtight, so Edwin would have to yell and scream to get out and get himself caught. But days passed, and Edwin made no attempt to escape. Curious and worried that his plan had failed, Burroughs goes into the tree and is horrified to see the dead body of Edwin, and stacks of construction paper that had odd symbols and shapes written on them. Edwin had also written, "I'm sorry," on almost all of the papers. The door of the tree would suddenly close, and Burroughs dies. The timeline of the Mimic in Tales is strange, because there is a large gap of information that is missing from these stories. We go from Mimic killing a Fazbear team at the end of the Mimic story, to then the Mimic reappearing in the epilogues as a burnt endo with a new voice box and a new shiny head with rabbit ears. And somehow there were more Mimic endos out there made by Fazbears. So what happened in between those events? Why is a Mimic burned? Why does he have a new head? What happened to the other Mimic endos? And it wasn't just the Mimic. It seems like Edwin also has gone through something we haven't seen. First off, in the Mimic story, he was very tight with money, so much so, he wasn't able to put David in kindergarten. And yet it's said in the Storyteller that Edwin ran away and traveled the whole world for the better part of 3 decades until he ran out of money. So where did all that money come from? Edwin in the Storyteller also all of a sudden cares about Fazbear Entertainment and the brand, and felt insulted when Mr. Burroughs suggested that an AI can just replace the creative team, when, in the Mimic, Edwin hated his job and felt what he was doing for Fazbear's was ridiculous. And another thing to point out, when Edwin discovered that the Storyteller was running the Mimic 1 program, this is what he said. Of course, the Storyteller's operating system was password protected, but Edwin didn't need to get into the system to learn what he'd come here to learn. What he had hoped he wouldn't find was right there on the start screen. The Storyteller was running a program called Mimic 1. "No," Edwin whispered. His worst fears were confirmed. He'd known it. He'd tried to pretend he hadn't known it, but he'd known it. He'd known it from the very beginning. No wonder the Pizzaplex characters were changing. No wonder problems were cropping up all over. It was happening again, and Edwin had no idea what to do about it. We have never heard of something like the storyteller ever happening in the past, and yet Edwin says something like it did happen. This was even foreshadowed in the beginning of the story, where when the board decides to build the storyteller, Edwin feels a sense of déjà vu. So something similar like the storyteller happened decades prior. This hidden incident seems to be referenced in the epilogues. The notebook that the teens find states that the original mimic began mimicking not just the animatronics, but also people, and it did it in ways that weren't intended. While it's not said what it did, the notebook says that if anyone encounters a mimic endo, it should be immediately deactivated and dismantled. So the original mimic did something that resulted in the other mimics to be deactivated. This hidden incident, I think, might be what Secret of the Mimic will be about. Or at least that's what happened just before the events of the game. So what else do we know about this hidden incident? Again from the storyteller, and there it was. There was the thing of Edwin's nightmares. Edwin gritted his teeth and held his breath again. He ignored the tremors that vibrated through his body. The three men had returned to their task, which was to carry into the hollow tree trunk a giant white tiger head. Not a real tiger head, obviously. If the thing the men were hefting was a real tiger head, Edwin wouldn't be as rattled as he was. Ha, he thought. Rattled was an understatement. He'd had a full-blown, nearly untethered from reality meltdown. No disembodied tiger head would have caused that, unless it was like this tiger head. Edwin retreated 12 feet to the trunk's far wall, and sat on the tree's ceramic floor tiles. He took 3 long, deep breaths. The images were streaking through his mind again, the same way they had when he'd first seen the tiger head being carried into the tree. They were worse this time, though. Of course they were. The blank metal tiger head had triggered the old emotions, but this version of the tiger head was even more reminiscent of the one that haunted him. Edwin pressed a hand against the cold, smooth interior wall of the tree trunk, and he stood. He took a step toward the tiger head and examined how it was interfaced with the wall. Was the tiger movable? Was it designed to be mobile? No, the tiger was stationary. It wouldn't suddenly come to life and attack. In 2 separate occasions, Edwin is said to fear the white tiger head, and is something that haunted him in his nightmares. He even feared that the head would come to life and attack. Which is interesting because the only white tiger we saw before the storyteller was just David's and Mimic's plushies, and David's bed, which was made to look like a white tiger head. But none of these things would logically haunt Edwin for decades. So this most likely ties with the Secret of the Mimic, because the Mimic will most likely wear the white tiger costume and attack us. Speaking of the white tiger, him existing as a mascot suit is weird, because why would this exist at all? There was never any mention of a white tiger mascot in the books. This thing existing could be because Edwin made it as a tribute to his son, which means that Edwin did return after the events of the Mimic story, which is somewhat hinted in the storyteller. Edwin had enjoyed the vintage posters. Mr. Burroughs, however, had ordered the old posters removed as soon as he had become the board chairman. He was going to have to put them in the trash, but Edwin had rescued them and taken them home. He wasn't sure why he'd wanted them. He hadn't hung them on the walls of his pathetic one-bedroom walk-up. In all honesty, Fazbear posters reminded Edwin of a past he'd rather have forgotten. If he'd been forced to explain himself, he'd probably have to admit that keeping the signboards was a form of self-punishment. He had much to atone for and no way to do it. Maybe keeping the images of Freddy Fazbear closed was Edwin's way of keeping himself on the hook for all the mistakes he'd made. Mistakes that had snowballed into a disaster the day he'd agreed to sell his company to the behemoth that was Fazbear Entertainment. From what this part is implying is that Edwin did something and he blames himself for it. You might say he could just blame himself for David's death, but this seems to be more than that. I mean, why would keeping old Fazbear posters be a sort of punishment for him? He didn't necessarily have similar posters in his factory, but we do see multiple Fazbear posters in Murray's costume manner. Another thing we know about this hidden incident is from Tiger Rock, where it's said that Tiger Rock had learned how to play hide and seek a long time ago. Since we never saw David play hide and seek with Mimic, Mimic must have learned it during this hidden incident. Alright, I know I've talked plenty already, but there's still more to talk about. So let's just make a quick recap before we continue. Also, if you're enjoying this video so far, please like and subscribe, and also follow my Twitter account. That would be greatly appreciated. So to recap, at some point after the Mimic story, Fazbears eventually get the Mimic, and they make multiple Mimic endos. An incident occurred where the original Mimic did something, and that resulted in the other Mimic endos to be deactivated. That incident involved Mimic learning hide and seek, an aggressive white tiger mascot, which Edwin would be haunted by, a location that experienced numerous glitches like the Mega Pizzaplex, and a fire that burned most of the Mimic. And lastly, Edwin was somehow involved in the incident and somewhat blames himself for numerous things, and he had enough money to travel the world for 30 years. Alright, we talked a lot about the books. Let's now take a deep dive into Secret of the Mimic. So a couple of things to note about the game's description. The blog calls Edwin a recluse inventor. I wouldn't really look at Edwin from the Mimic and describe him as a recluse. Edwin in the Storyteller, sure, but in the Mimic he wasn't really a recluse. He just didn't have any time for anyone. But I think if Edwin did come back shortly after his son's death, he would maybe be a recluse and distant to other people. And the blog also references Mimic's abilities to flicker nearby lights, which is seen in both the epilogues and Ruin, but interestingly is not seen in the Mimic story. So Mimic probably learned this ability during Secret of the Mimic. Another thing, the Mimic's head looking different compared to Ruin is probably to tie in with the epilogues, because the Mimic has a different head. So Murray's costume manor, from what info and images we got, seems to be a warehouse for a lot of Fazbear Entertainment properties. But it's not just that, the manor also has a small gift shop that sells masks and prizes, and it also held performances and attractions. And I think this is the place where the original Fazbear Entertainment animatronic creation team mentioned in the epilogues worked. And I do think this place was made after the Mimic story, and is where the hidden incident from Tales occurred. But how does the Mimic tie into this? The Mimic is stated to be Fazbear Entertainment technology, and is able to adapt to any costume and become any character. Which is odd because the Mimic wasn't originally made for Fazbears and isn't designed to adapt into any costume. But we do know that the Mimic Model 1s and 2s were designed to fit into any costume. And since the Mimic is called a prototype, I think what happened here is that Edwin, or someone else, modified the Mimic and gave it its shape-shifting abilities to be able to fit into any costume and be able to turn into a freaky spider robot. Since the Costume Manor hosted shows, I think, like in the Storyteller, Fazbear's planned to use the Mimic Endos and the Mimic One program to make animatronics to perform at the Manor. Maybe Edwin heard about what Fazbears were planning and decided to come back, so the building would be named after him. But something eventually went wrong, and it resulted in the warehouse to be damaged and abandoned, and Edwin going missing. So what happened, and why was the place abandoned? From what we gathered from Tales, I think the reason everything went wrong is because the original Mimic mimicked people in unexpected ways. Probably customers who visited the shows. Then something happened and the Mimic Endos are deactivated. But since Edwin says that something similar to the Storyteller happened before, I think the Mimic was actually able to influence the other Mimic models, and maybe even the other animatronics, to make them act in unnatural ways. Not dangerous per se, but odd. We know Mimic can influence other electronics like the lights, so what if it had the ability to corrupt the other bots, like how Burntrap did it in his boss fight? Which actually makes me torn on who we're gonna deal with in Secret of the Mimic, because we either only deal with the Mimic shifting into different costumes and animatronics, or we are going to deal with the Mimic and the other Mimic Endos that are corrupted. Because it's kinda hard to believe that the Mimic can wear animatronics. They already have Endos, how's the Mimic gonna squeeze into it? But on the other hand, We see this coil-style eyes that the Mimic has on both the mushroom suit and on this promotional image of Jackie, supporting that the Mimic will be the only threat, and Hand Unit does say that the Mimic can become any character. It's confusing at the moment, so we'll just have to wait and see when the game comes out. But what I am sure about is that the Mimic used the tiger mascot to attack people, and maybe even Edwin himself, which is why Edwin would be haunted by the white tiger. Another thing I think Secret of the Mimic could answer something for us is this part of the storyteller. Edwin had nothing of his own when he'd moved in, nothing but his clothes and toiletries, a handful of books, and a small item that sat dingy and belligerent on top of the dresser. Edwin knew he shouldn't have kept it, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It was the only thing he had left of a time that he shouldn't have been allowed to forget. Not that he hadn't tried. We never get to find out what that item is. It could be David's plushie, but it could be something else that will be revealed in Secret of the Mimic. Next thing I want to discuss is the importance of the MXES machine. I think a lot of us were surprised when we got to learn from FNaF's interview with Steelwool that MXES was an old machine. This was later expanded upon in Help Wanted 2's content update, where we once again saw the MXES machine, this time in a van. And since this van is right next to the costume manor, I think the machine that we see in Ruin came from the manor, which heavily suggests that MXES will be important in Secret of the Mimic. How? I have no idea. I think it's possible that there will be a bad ending, where the player collects the Mimic and gives it to Fazbear Entertainment, or maybe our player or Edwin create MXES, and the true ending of the game will be us turning it on, trapping and hiding the Mimic, and denying Fazbear's from ever using him again. So what's Mimic's secret? Right now I'm not sure what it could be. It can either be he saw something that could change everything about the lore, or maybe it has something to do with the Vanny mask. But we'll just have to wait and see. So now that we've compiled a lot of info, this is how I think the story of Secret of the Mimic will go. After the events of the Mimic, Fazbears were successfully able to capture the Mimic. Fazbears were insistent into making more Mimic models to utilize the Mimic 1 code, so they wouldn't have to program every show routine themselves, and the Mimic endos can just copy it. Edwin comes back and decides to work with Fazbears again, either because he has no money or he heard what Fazbears were going to plan with the Mimic, and decides to come back and take on the project himself, so no one else other than him would have control over the Mimic. Edwin creates Murr's Costume Manor to house all of his and the team's inventions and animatronics, and also make it an attraction for people to visit. Edwin modified the original Mimic and gives him his shape-shifting abilities to adapt into any costume, and so the other Mimic models were built. The Mimics would replicate animatronic performances, but the original Mimic took it a step further and mimicked humans in unintended ways. Edwin would maybe do something, and then the Mimic would corrupt the other Mimics and animatronics in the costume manner. It wasn't noticeable at first, but eventually the animatronics would become hostile. The creation team decides to discontinue the Mimic line, and started the process of deactivating the Mimics. But then the Mimic would wear the white tiger mascot and start attacking employees and killing them. Edwin would manage to escape, and he would feel guilty about what happened and run away. Fazbears would then send workers to retrieve the original Mimic. Some weren't successful. Then they would send in the player of Secret of the Mimic. At the end of the game, I predict that our player will decide to stop the Mimic. So we burn him, and possibly decapitate him as well, and then turn on the MXES machine to hide him and the other Mimics away. And that's how I think the story will go. So what do you think? I would like to hear your opinions down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, all that jazz, and I'll see you on the flip side.